this may be a bit different. We'll see. I'm not talking about AI. I apologise in advance. The research that I have done in my career early on was all about digital religion. But for the last few years, I've been thinking about religious education. So this is an opportunity to try and bring those two worlds together and suggest that there might be some things going on in the religious education world right now that could offer an interesting new perspective, an insight, a bit of a challenge into digital religion work. Yes, here we go. If you look at the early writing about the internet, early writing about digital religion, there's a lot of optimism. There's something wonderful happening with the internet. It's democratizing. It is empowering dissent, and dissent is obviously good. It is empowering marginal groups within churches to stand up against their overlords. In early writing about religion and the internet, the Vatican often features as sort of the example of how not to do religion online, as if there's something kind of built into the structure of the internet, into the structure of connectivity, that cannot possibly be compatible with institutional power as represented by the Pope. So here's a modern day example of that sort of rhetoric. You are the media. Through the glories of social media, the old intermediaries, the cultural authorities have been displaced, and we in this room have got the power to remake the future, which will obviously be a very good thing. I mean, if you haven't figured out where I'm going with this, then I congratulate you on being in a glorious bubble for the last 3 or 4 days. This is a message posted by Elon Musk on the 6th of November. It's his celebration message of victory in the US presidential election. And he posted it just after that. And that image on the other side says, let that sink in. And it's an image of Elon himself carrying a sink into the Oval Office. And the juxtaposition of those two messages, I think, is really interesting. So on the one hand, he's saying his SpaceX, this network that he has bought and then done to as he has done, is a space where truth can be spoken, the mainstream media has been sidelined, you as the users of social media have gained power, and at the same time he's very proudly saying that power has come to him personally. He has not just supported Trump's campaign has put him in his imagination into the Oval Office, and that image of a sink, you may recall, was a famous or infamous photograph that he posted when he bought the premises of Twitter. Just a dreadful pun of carrying in a sink into the building and saying, I own this now, let that sink in, ba-boom tish. So here's his image of him doing the same thing to the Oval Office, which looks to me like an image of ownership. He bought Twitter, now he's bought the Oval Office, and he's done it with the power of you, somehow. So there's a paradox at the heart of the digital, which we've recognised for a long time. That early dream that dissent would be democratizing, would be somehow positive, has been replaced by recognition that the internet both decentralizes and re-centralizes power, and when it empowers dissent, it's not always necessarily dissent that we agree with. And I say this, whatever position politically you sit in the room, there is probably somebody online who you disagree with very strongly. And if you don't know that yet, then there are some people online who you will disagree with very strongly, whatever you think about anything. So, that's a kind of starting point. That's the puzzle of power online, I guess. So I'm going to think a little about how we've discussed this in digital religion. I'm going to look at what the world of religious education might bring, perhaps, to that conversation, and then try and join them together with a religion and worldviews approach to digital religion at the end. Here's an example of the sort of classic optimism that I'm referring to. This is a message from Bishop Jacques Goyot, published in Time magazine in 1998. Time magazine published a cover story about religion on the internet, religion online in the 1990s, which is very annoying to read now, because basically every question that comes up in that Time magazine article has then occupied the digital religion world for the next many decades. And we like to pretend that we've thought of all sorts of interesting things to discuss, but a lot of this stuff was apparent right from the outset. But one of the things they include in that magazine article is an interview with a Catholic bishop. Jacques Guyot, who you may perhaps remember, was a Catholic bishop in France, and he was sidelined by the Catholic Church in the early 1990s for being too radical in his left-wing politics. And he was moved from the French diocese of Évreux to the North African diocese of Parthenia. So he was still a bishop, he still had a diocese, but Parthenia was now desert. Like many hundreds of years ago, people lived there, nobody lived there anymore. So he was still a bishop, but a bishop of a space where very few people actually lived. And what he did in response to this was to re-establish Parthenia as the diocese without borders on the internet. And say, right, well, in that case, I shall be the bishop of the internet and everyone can join my club. And that he set up a website, which you can still find today, and talked about this quite triumphantly. So you can see in the language of this quote, on the internet, says Guyot, there is no question of someone imposing rules on the way people communicate. The net has no centre from which will can be applied. The Pope can't stop me online because the internet hasn't got an off button. The information wants to be free is another kind of early catchphrases that was much bandied about. So the idea here is that there's something kind of structurally built into the internet that promotes dissent and empowers dissent. And, at least in this vision, that is going to be good for the world, or good for society. Here's a more kind of academically complicated way of sort of exploring the same issue. Manuel Castells was a sociologist of the internet who wrote lots of books in the 90s, early 2000s about the network society, the networked galaxy, talking about how the world was going to be reconnected through digital technologies, moving away from neighborhoods and communities and unions and corporations and traditional forms of power towards global networks of information flow. And in this more recent book from 2012, he talks about how power works in a network society. And he says in a longer quote before this that there's a space for coercion. Control and domination have got a role to play in society. That's one of the ways that power operates. But really, the most effective way of exercising power over people is to have power over the way they understand the world. So if you control the networks through which they communicate, and you control the way that people make meaning in the world, what they can understand to be meaningful, then your power over them is far more kind of deep-rooted than if you just tell them what to do and boss them around. So therefore, crucial bit here, the transformation of the communication environment directly affects the forms of meaning construction and therefore the production of power relationships. But in lots of different ways. So Castells has a kind of broader vision here than the early hopes of Parthenia. So power will be the ability to program those networks and the ability to connect and switch between networks. And there'll be new sorts of power figures who emerge who are able to transmit information from, say, government to media, or media to, religion, or the different networks in society. And this creates the paradox that I'm talking about, in which quite different visions of society are simultaneously empowered. I include these two images here, not specific. Well, I could have included images from a number of different global conflicts, but one of the things that, for example, in Castells' books, he sees as a wonderful positive force of the internet is the empowering of citizen journalism. Through digital communication, everybody has a witnessing device on them at all times, your phone. Your phone can take photographs, it can record video, it can share your experience, and it can transmit that into networks to share your message with a wider world. So the power of professional journalists to determine the story of what's going on is reduced. But what we see is that ability to communicate realities and to flood our networks of meaning-making with rival truths is being used in lots of different ways by citizen journalists, but also by military journalists, by state journalists, by information producers of all sorts. So in the current conflict in Palestine, for example, you see some slightly earlier Western lionising of the Palestinian citizen journalist. A lot of the citizen journalists who were talked about in those articles like this one from The Guardian actually had to leave the country quite quickly. What has replaced their sort of citizen witnessing is people like the IDF publishing their own videos of successful military operations. You can see this again in the conflict in Ukraine. You see both Russian and Ukrainian soldiers and military units constantly producing their own edited video narratives to tell the world what's going on. And of course attempting to discredit one another's narratives to make it as difficult as possible to believe in the alternative stories that are being told. So you have both dissent and the recentering of power and the dominance of institutions at the same time. So that's our kind of digital religion puzzle. The story as I've presented it to you there, I think, is... yes, the power is both decentralised and re-centralised online. The question is, have we got some interesting frameworks to say anything about this? Now, digital religion as an academic field draws a lot on cultural studies, on social sciences, on media studies. There's a bit of a disconnect often between what happens in digital religion and what's being said in digital theology. Partly because the frameworks, the theories, the questions being asked in those two fields don't have a huge amount in common. So it's still, if you pick up a work of digital theology and you look in the bibliography, fairly common to find they're not actually citing any digital religion work at all, and vice versa. So, is there something we could do as a way forward? Hopefully. This is where I'm going to move on to my second point and see what we might learn from the world of religious education. So, religious education. This is a compulsory subject in England and Wales, and it's got lots and lots of problems. RE happens in all schools, but it's a unique subject because it's not in the national curriculum. Never has been. Instead, there are about 150 different local council organisations, council committees, that are supposed to come up with different curricula all over the country. So you're supposed to be able to come up with a special syllabus that will reflect your local area and the agreement of your local group. Very, very difficult to do. And then academies do something else, independent schools do something else, faith schools do something else. So there's this hugely inconsistent curriculum. With that comes an inconsistent vision. With that comes terrible teacher recruitment and retention and teacher training problems, limited support from pupils, parents, schools, governments. This is a compulsory subject. It's not necessarily a subject that's highly valued in a lot of parts of society. And there's also the question of demographic and religious change. As younger people, the children going through school increasingly have no personal connection to religion. Why are they doing this at all? How do you make it meaningful and interesting to those kids? Now, about 5 years ago, a solution was proposed to all of these problems. And the solution comes from an independent commission on RE, and that's been picked up by the national RE associations and pushed since then in the face of often quite bitter controversy. The solution is to move to something called a religion and worldviews approach. There's a quote here you can see. The time is right for a new vision for our subjects to prepare children and young people for living in the increasingly diverse world in which they find themselves. So what is a religion and worldviews approach? The idea underlying this, and I think this has been taken by the RE community from people working in religious studies, is that the traditional approach to the study of religion in both schools and universities is something called the world religions paradigm. The world religions paradigm says there's a certain limited number of big religions in the world that are all quite similar. They've got rituals, they've got sacred texts, they've got hierarchies, they've got temples. And you can basically kind of draw up a list of the key points of each group and learn them from memory. That's an approach that's been hugely criticised in religious studies. And the Commission on RE thought, what if worldview was a better way forward? Kind of it's referred to sometimes as a Kano kind of concept, a different starting point for the subject. So a worldview, and this is an idea taken from German philosophy originally, is this is a crucial bit here, a person's way of understanding, experiencing, and responding to the world. A philosophy of life. A person's worldview is likely to influence and be influenced by beliefs, values, behaviours, experiences, identities, commitments, etc. So, a person's way of understanding, experiencing, and responding to the world. That's the crucial phrase. So what does that mean? So a person's way of understanding, experiencing, and responding to the world is universal. Everyone's got one. Not everybody is religious, but everybody has a worldview. That worldview could be religious or non-religious. So you're creating a kind of even playing field on which to bring in, say, humanist perspectives to interrogate alongside Christian, Muslim, etc. These worldviews are diverse. Each of you has your own personal worldview, which might be different from anyone else's. But they can also be formalised. This is where you get towards theology or philosophy. People come up with formal understandings of the world that are embedded in institutions or systematic theological textbooks. And it's multidisciplinary. So this idea of worldview has a history in theology and philosophy and religious studies. And those disciplines all come together in the classroom when you're trying to understand people's individual worldviews or the institutional or organised worldviews of religious communities. So that's the theory. You're still studying religions, but you're studying it from the starting point of people's lived understanding of the world around them. So, is that useful? Let's see if we can apply that to the world of digital religion. I think this is quite an interesting phrase. Now, the puzzle here, I guess, is, or a starting point, has what goes on in the world of RE got anything to do with the academic study of theology and religion? And a lot of people who work in RE would actually say no, that these subjects have different purposes. There's something more formative going on in schools that is not happening in universities. I think that's a mistake. I think we should see the study of religion across all levels of the educational system as a unity. So what happens in school is in partnership with what happens at university. It is the attempt to understand religious and non-religious ways of making sense of the world, something like that. Yes, schools are trying to do something formative and reflexive, so we're trying to do that at university as well. That's not particularly unusual. So if the school and the university systems are connected, like one big intellectual project, I would like to see what happens at school level in RE as actually part of the constructive project of trying to make sense of religion, and therefore as developing ideas and paradigms that we can also be using in cutting-edge academic research. Again, an exchange of ideas across levels of the educational system, not just a filtering down of academic research into the classroom. So that's my starting point here. So this idea, a worldview as a person's way of understanding, experiencing, and responding to the world. Could we bring that into the study of digital religion? Well, people have done quite a lot with worldviews as a concept in there's a religious studies approach, a more sociological approach, super classic religious studies approach from Ninian Smart, also a theology text over on the end. These traditional academic approaches to worldviews are actually not quite the same thing as what's happening in schools at the moment. In a lot of these, say in Anne Tave's work, worldviews are being used as a suggested replacement for the study of religion. The study of religion has all sorts of academic problems. Ditch the whole thing and let's all go into worldview studies. That kind of idea. On the other hand, in a project like this one, or Ninian Smart's work, worldview is used as a kind of categorizing tool. So we can go beyond religious labels and chop the world up into 6 or 8 or 10 like worldview communities. In a lot of theological work, that's then a kind of missionary tool. So you divide the world up into a number of theological groups, or worldview communities, you demonstrate that Christianity has got the best one, and then you can come up with missionary strategies to convert all the others. This isn't what schools are doing, really. The idea of a religion and worldviews approach hangs on to the significance of institutional and organised religion as a subject worthy of study, but it brings in some of the insights about how people make sense of the world around them as well. And I think when you recognise that, you can see worldview thinking within the philosophy of technology. That question, how do people understand and make sense of the world around them, is a very significant question in the philosophy of technology. We saw earlier Jacques Ellul was discussed. Ellul is an example of this that I use in my own classroom. Someone who said, what's significant about technology is not what one device or another is doing, it's how technology as a whole is being used to reshape the way we see ourselves and the way we see the world. There's a quote here from philosopher Martin Heidegger in his Question Concerning Technology, which is sort of the foundational work in the philosophy of technology. And there's something, he's not using the word worldview here, but there's something similar going on. What's important about technology is not what any specific device does, it's how our whole way of relating to being, to existence, to the world, is changed by the technologies that we're using. So there's a kind of a justification for doing this, I think, in our history. So, with that encouragement, you could reframe the digital religion question as something like this. How do digital media contribute to individual and organised ways of understanding, experiencing and responding to the world? That's a bigger question than we've asked in a lot of digital religion research, which has been much more kind of specifically focused on specific communities, specific platforms, specific practices. This is a kind of a bigger worldviews issue that can be explored. How am I doing for time? Oh, okay, I'm doing great. So, what does that look like? Here's 3 ways that we could go about thinking of digital religion in a worldviews perspective. Well, most obvious maybe, would be to look at where media are being used to form worldviews. Media as worldview forming technologies. This is a video game called Guardians of Ancora, which was created by Scripture Union in this country, and was fairly successful a few years ago. What's really interesting about Guardians of Ancora is that it's a Bible game. You know, it's aimed at children. You're supposed to be playing in a way that enables you to learn Bible stories. But I would say the Bible story content is kind of secondary in Guardians of Ancora. The grand story that's being told is that there is a world called Ancora, which is sort of science fiction, fantasy landscape. You're a citizen of Ancora, the world is going dark, you need to, for reasons not fully explained, dive into a sort of biblical landscape and follow Jesus around in order to gather the resources that will bring light to your world, bring light back to Ancora. I think if they'd had more funding, there was more of a narrative to be built around that. But that's kind of the mechanic. You go from Ancora, you dive into the biblical world, you follow Jesus around collecting little items that then light up the world when you get back. And sure, so one of the things you do as you go around is watch some Bible stories unfold and learn some Bible facts. But having interviewed the people who created the game, what they were really interested in is the child learning the importance of following Jesus. Like, that's the game. The game says you are a hero. By following Jesus, you can save the world. By just chasing after Jesus through this game, you're bringing light to the world that you live in, more or less. So that act of following Jesus, the idea of forming a worldview around pursuing Jesus, is more significant than the Bible knowledge that might be going on in the individual missions. I could give other examples, but hopefully you get what I'm talking about. Media can be used as worldview forming technologies. Second idea. Hopefully Geoffrey Mahan would not mind his book being used as an example of this. Would be to talk about media as a worldview. This is a bit more straightforward. It's maybe in some ways going back to the Jacques Guyot dream of Parthenia, that says actually digital media is set up in a way that promotes a specific kind of worldview. In this case, the idea of the church as network. By engaging with the digital world, you are embracing a particular kind of digital theology, and that is a theology of networked connection that Mahan explains in that book. So the idea here is that there's a particular worldview that's embedded within the media that we're using. And the third suggestion, which I'll explore a little bit more, is the idea of media as constellations of theological affordances. And the example I've borrowed here is this book, Unruly Souls. If you're interested in what digital religion has to say about dissent, this is a very good one to look at, published by Kristen Peterson a couple of years ago, looking at Christian and Muslim feminist activism in online spaces. So here's something that Kristen says in about chapter 4 of Unruly Souls, where she's writing about a podcast. What's interesting about podcasting? She's looking particularly at feminist podcasts that in the context of this group might be thought of as dissenting podcasts. These are podcasts where people get together and talk about their disagreements with the wider religious tradition that they're situated in. And this are a few quotes from that chapter. Podcasts provide an intimate space to dig deep into issues of spirituality and faith. And the intimacy is crucial for her analysis. There's a closeness as the hosts speak into your ears. So she's imagining here podcasting as something you listen to through your earbuds while you go about your day-to-day life. So that because you're listening through your earbuds, the host is whispering straight into your ear, and there's an intimacy that you don't get from, say, the movies. There's a closeness as the hosts speak into your ears while you do chores, get ready in the morning, etc. And all of these elements contribute, and here in the longer section she's talking not just about wearing earbuds and the rhythm of when you listen, but also the style of conversation that the hosts are having. The importance that the hosts are in their own home talking in their domestic setting and you're listening in your domestic setting. So it's all kind of contextual stuff. All of these elements contribute to developing an intimate medium through which people in small communities are able to connect with each other. So her argument is there's something special that happens in this podcast that's a mix of the technology, the context, the genre, the style of communication, the style of listening that is perfectly suited to promoting a kind of dissenting space. A small, intimate community of people who want to be united in their dissent. So, how could we analyse that using a religion and worldviews approach? This is not the approach that Peterson uses necessarily. This is what I'm suggesting we apply to that quotation. So what we can see here, I think, is that the podcast medium is not teaching dissent to the audience. It's not as straightforward as that. It's not that the podcast medium has built within it a particular dissenting worldview or theology. Rather, it's creating an affordance. Now, affordances are a crucial idea from media studies. Basically, your affordance is the possibilities that the technology gives you. It's not embedded in the technology itself. So an affordance is what the technology allows you to do, and that's going to be specific to your context. So that might be something that you as a lecturer, or you as a student, or you as a church leader find that the technology helps you to do, which it might not help someone else to do. So the affordance of the technology is a possibility of action that is specifically generated in your context, in your interaction with a device or a technology or a platform. What I'm suggesting here is that affordances are not just technological, they're also theological. Particular technologies create opportunities that resonate with particular worldviews, particular attitudes, particular ways of understanding and responding to the world. So here, for example, there we go. In this case, the technology is creating an opportunity that resonates with people within a particular Christian theological feminist tradition, those podcast listeners. They're not sort of taken into the tradition by the podcast, but the podcast empowers and strengthens that tradition because of the affordances it offers to that particular theology. So that was the theological affordance. I also wonder if we could have a theology of affordances. I move to a different book here. This is probably something that some of you have read if you're interested in digital theology, a book by Kate Ott called Christian Ethics for a Digital Society, published 2019. One of the passages I really enjoyed in this book is a discussion of the Tower of Babel story. And Ott turns this around and says, you might think the Tower of Babel is about the evil of technology. It's about men building a mighty tower because of their hubris, and then God smashes the tower and curses them with diversity of languages. And she turns this around and says, that's not true. The sin of the Tower of Babel was not the pride of building, it was the attempt to enforce conformity. It was the fact that everybody was trying to speak the same language that was the problem. The Tower of Babel was a technology that enforced conformity, and God liberates the people from that by giving them the gift of diversity. So Ott's way of taking that story is to ask, as we develop, shape and reshape technologies, are we doing so in a way that encourages difference and maximizes diversity, similar to Babel, or are we reducing diversity? So there's a theology that she's building around affordances, although that's not exactly the word she uses. A theology of what technology should be able to do for us. Okay, so this is going back to my suggestion of a digital religion approach, using a religion and worldviews approach, coming up to the question of dissent, that's the topic of the conference. How do digital media empower and structure dissent within individual and organised ways of understanding, experiencing and responding to the world? And there you go. Thank you for listening. That's what I think we should do.